Hello, my name's Hartland Brown. I'm an architect on the Solution Innovation team here at Snowflake, specifically the Frameworks team. And I'm here today to talk about our Data Enrichment Framework, or the API Enrichment Framework. What this is used for is anybody who wants to expose an API to a consumer down through a native app in the marketplace. This is going to allow a consumer to take a table, map certain fields to the API to put it out to the API, and then get data back down so that it can be saved with that table for any future use. My example today is that I'll be using address data, putting it up to an API and getting the latitude and longitude back. The first thing we're going to do is go over setup. So once you've got the code downloaded from the GitHub, hop over to providersetup.sql and run these first 7 commands. What this is going to do is this is going to set up the application package, a stage for all of your files, and a metadata table to share any kind of data down to the consumer for configuration. Specifically for this application, our config is going to be the fields necessary for operating the API. Once you've got all of this done, you can put all of your files up onto the stage that we just made. And if you don't want to follow the tutorial and you actually want to use your own API, at this point, please hop over to the enrich data and the get match ID files. The enriched data is going to have all of the logic for parsing any of the data out and sending it up to the API through the getMatchID file, which is going to actually call the API. Here between these 2 lines of comments, you can see that the first thing I'm doing is creating a JSON load that I'll use for the API. And then after I call the API with the getMatchID file, I will then take the response and parse it out and put it back into the data frame that I used. For this API, it's relatively simple, so we're going to be going line by line, but of course you can also do this in batches if your API supports batch loading. And as an additional call out, I did set a limit of 10 just for testing. The API that I'm using is a free API with a limit of a couple of hundred, so if you do want to use the API that I used for this demo, I just recommend keeping that limit there while you're playing around. And then at any point, if you're ready for production, you can remove the limit here and here. Once you've set up all the parsing logic here, you can hop over to getMatchID, and I'm using api.myptv.com for just geocoding lat long. So you can see I'm looking for city, region, postal code, street address, and country code. This is just where you'll actually send up the payload. I recommend having all the parsing for the data in the enrichdata.py file. The second thing you need to check if you are changing this is if you're going to use any kind of different credentials than I did. I'm just using an API string, just an API token, but we also support the OAuth frameworks and we support username and password. So if you're going to make those changes, you'll have to change this line here, as well as hop over to the setup hello.sql file and change the endpoint as well as the type of payload. So whether you're using OAuth, password, generic string, here in get configuration for reference. This is actually going to set the configuration that the user will see when they set up their API tokens and their approvals for any kind of endpoints using the permissions SDK. And we'll go over that in a minute. Once you've got all of this done, go ahead and put all of the files up to the stage, and then hop back over to providersetup.sql and run these 3 commands. The first one's going to set up your first version. This is going to target the stage that we've created for the application and grab all of the files that we've uploaded to create the first version of the application package. The second line is going to actually create a test version of the application on provider side so that we can play around with it. And then the third is going to set up a streamlet that we've created called the connector manager. So what this is going to do is actually let us set the fields. Once you've run these 3 commands, let's actually hop over to that connector manager. So here at the connector manager, it's 100% about just setting up the fields that you want the consumer to map for the API. I needed 5 fields. If you need more than that, you can click add field as much as you need to add fields, subtract field to subtract field. It'll auto-populate with 1. But no matter what, at the end, when you've got all your fields set up for the mapping, just click this save button, and those will get pumped down through the application to the consumer for the mapping. At this point, we're all set up. So now all we have to do is test our application and see what the consumer side interaction is going to feel like. So I'm going to hop over to my application. And on first opening for the consumer, I've got it set up so that if there's no API key, if the API endpoint hasn't been approved, and if the permissions that we want above and beyond that, for this example, we'll be using create database and run managed tasks. If any of those permissions are not granted to the application will not let you proceed to any other pages. You'll be stuck here on the settings page. So first, you would set your API key. Again, for this example, I'm using a secret value. I'm not using username, password, or OAuth, but it would all show up here no matter what. And this is all using the permissions SDK. After we're done with that, we approve the endpoint. Again, this was what we changed in that setup. If you are not using my given API, then go ahead and use whatever. If you are trying to use api.myptv.com to get a user token, just go ahead and hop over to their website and register. They've got a free trial period that lets you do a couple of hundred calls a day. So at that point, you have plenty of room to play with this framework and keep that limit on so that you can play around with it. And then once you're comfortable with it, you can start moving on to your own API and your own logic. After that, we grant whatever extra permissions your application happens to need. Again, mine's just create database and execute managed task. At this point, we'll get a little notification saying the application is configured and we can go to the main page. So after you've set up a couple of tasks, a couple of enrichments, you'll see that I have a task here scheduled. It's showing up on the main page, and I can see all of the different metadata that goes into it, the mapping for it, where the output table is, as well as the warehouse size for that task and how often it's running. And if I'm not crazy about the way I set it up, I can delete it as well. If you want to make a new enrichment, just go ahead and click this Enrich Data button. The first thing it'll ask you to do is pick a table. I've already picked a table, but just to show you how the permissions SDK works, you click that Pick Table button, and that'll pop up this window. This will allow you to actually browse all of the tables that you have access to in the entire platform, and then you can hop through, add, and remove any kind of tables that you want. Next, we're going to hop out to the mapping page. These are the fields that we set up in the connector creator. So if you haven't done that at this point, you'll get a warning, and then you'll have to hop over to the connector manager in order to play around with the different fields. But since we already took care of that, I've got my fields here. We're going to set up the mapping. And then just for posterity's sake, we've included a little bit of a demo here, so that you can take a look at your data preview. This is just the data as it appears in that table as it is. If you take a look at this and you don't think that this is right, you can go back to the pick table and choose a different table. Of course, this is just here to preview the data. Once you've done that, you can choose your output table. And once you've picked a name for the output table, you'll have two options. You can either run the enrichment or schedule the enrichment to happen on a regular basis. We're going to go ahead and create another task. So click Schedule, and we're going to name our task. I'll name this one My First Task API. And then you choose your warehouse size as well as the schedule. I have a pretty small API, so I'm going to keep it as small, and my schedule can be hourly at the moment just because we're not going to let this last very long. As an additional call out, because we have that create database permission, the application will create its own database that will be exposed to the user. And all data currently as it's configured will show up under enrichment.data.whatever you name your output table. So we're going to go ahead and save this task. Looks like this task was successfully saved. So now if we hop back to the main page, our task will show up here. And again, you can hop through here, you can look and see what the target table was, what the output table is, and any of the data mappings that you have for it, as well as the different settings. And if I really wasn't crazy about how I set it up, I can delete it. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete this first task. And now I just have one task that's scheduled. At this point, the task should have started up and run its first time. So I'm going to hop over to a worksheet and take a look at that data. And as you can see, my data city, ISO code, postal code, region, and street address have been seeded with a latitude and longitude. And this is living in enrichment.data, just like the application said it would. So that's pretty much everything that goes into setting up the application for the first time. As soon as you're production ready, you can set the application ready for external and host it on the marketplace. There's a lot of guides out here on how to do that. But otherwise, if you guys run into any problems or anything, please leave a comment on the GitHub so that you can help us have feedback for any way we can improve on this framework. Thank you very much.